So my name is Patrick Eilers, and I'm a licensed professional counselor here in the state of Michigan, the United States. And so I've been a counselor for about 10 years now. And so at the end of 2024, when I left the previous place I was working for, I decided to start my own practice and really kind of focus the coaching more on helping owners of these mental health practices become better owners. Really, and the idea there is that if you're a great owner, not only because you're a great therapist, but also being a great owner, you can really solidify a better culture in your practice and at the same time be able to really make an impact on the clinicians as well as the people that you serve.
Yeah, so true. And do you think that burnout is becoming the new norm of today's culture?
I think it certainly captures a lot of physical burnout. You're just tired a lot of the time, you're maybe getting sick, those kind of things. I think it also captures some intellectual burnout as well, right? Like if you feel like you're just doing repetitive motions over and over again kind of thing. So it does kind of capture a lot of different aspects of that. And, there's also a lack of support. If I don't feel like I have a lot of people around me, whether it be my clinical team that I work with, or maybe it's my owner or whatever the case is, I'm probably going to feel a little more isolated. The more isolated I am as a therapist, the more
Hello, hello, welcome to Mindset to Results. What if success isn't making you happier, healthier, or more fulfilled? In today's episode, I am joined by Patrick Eilers, founder of Bloomworks Concepts and Coaching, who helps organizations and individuals build healthier, more sustainable ways of working and living. Together, we'll explore why so many high achievers are struggling with burnout and what it really takes to create success that supports your mental health, relationships, and overall well being. Hi, Patrick.
Hi, Elena. Thanks so much for having me today. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to our conversation.
You're most welcome. Before we start this episode, I would like you to share a little bit about yourself. What makes you so passionate about what you do?
So my name is Patrick Eilers, and I'm a licensed professional counselor here in the state of Michigan, the United States. And so I've been a counselor for about 10 years now. So I've been worked in a variety of different parts of the mental health field in the outpatient area. Really specifically, outpatient is, you kind of think a more traditional type of setting rather than like an inpatient, which is more like in a hospital setting. Been an adjunct professor. I've taught intro psychology in a couple of different universities levels here. I've worked with groups, I've worked with kids, I've worked with couples, I've kind of worked with everybody. I specialized in sex addiction for about 4 years of my career. So I've kind of seen a lot of different how different practices work, especially space, how kind of a general practice works, things like that. And so really kind of as a clinician, I've worked in a lot of these different settings, and I've noticed that one of the things that a lot of the places I've worked for, although they may be the therapists and the people working there may be really great folks. They have sometimes a tendency to have unhealthy cultures. And so at the end of 2024, when I left the previous place I was working for, I decided to start my own practice and really kind of focus the coaching more on helping owners of these mental health practices become better owners. Really, and the idea there is that if you're a great owner, not only because you're a great therapist, but also being a great owner, you can really solidify a better culture in your practice and at the same time be able to really make an impact on the clinicians as well as the people that you serve. And so the whole idea of my business is really about trying to not only just improve culture, but also try to help, what's your vision of your practice? What's your legacy of your practice? How do you turn your practice over when you're ready to retire? What's your operations? What's your pay structure? Those kind of things. So really, I could set a practice up in theory from, beginning to end, in helping someone be able to do that. So that's kind of really where a lot of my passion came from about wanting to help practices, because a lot of my experiences have been that that's a tough place to be when you work in a culture where it's hard to come to work, even if you enjoy doing what you're doing, but it's an uncomfortable place to sometimes be when you know that you may not have support that you need as a clinician. And certainly, I think that also probably extends to other businesses as well. So that's kind of the story of Bloomworks and how that came to be.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Why do so many people f- show to be successful and high performing from outside? Yes, and it looks like they have it all, and inside they struggling internally.
I think there's a lot of things you said about, sort of taking time to slow down, especially when you're a high achieving person. You tend to sort of keep taking more and more on, and we see this, sort of throughout different aspects in different businesses. Certainly, the more you're as an owner, I think it's easier, especially well in this clinician world. Certainly, the idea that you're kind of mostly trained to be a therapist, and so, being a therapist is learning about how what works for you to help translate that to helping other clients. When you're an owner, you have to kind of sort of take a step back and kind of more focus on the idea of, okay, how do I, take these same skills I have and be able to apply them as an owner? I think a lot of the times that comes from slowing down, but it also comes from sort of the mindset of understanding, like as an owner, I can't just give my leftovers of who I am as a clinician to the ownership. I kind of have to be an owner, 50% of the time at minimum, probably, if not more. And so when I make that transition, part of it is a mindset, but part of it also is making the time to support the clinicians and make sure that there's enough running in the practice that I don't have to necessarily be the full delegator. A lot of clinicians also want to be like the final say in a lot of stuff that happens, and they may not have the trust systems around them to be able to do that well. And so I think it's a combination of, going too fast, not putting the right systems in place. I think there's certainly an aspect of it that, the busier you are, it's harder to be able to make that time, especially when you feel like you have to continue to give more and more. And as a therapist, a lot of people feel like they want to impact the world more and more, and the more people they can see, the more successful they'll sort of end up being. But I think that that can definitely get out of balance pretty quickly. And so, how much every session takes out of you as a clinician is how much also it's going to impact you as an owner. And so, you have to kind of know and weigh that probably equally in some sense, because if you don't step into ownership, they're only going to get what's left of you versus getting a much higher amount of you with your emotional sort of energy, so to speak. So I think a lot of owners I see certainly, and I've been around, have been that they're very great clinicians in a lot of ways, and they're very passionate what they do. But they don't know how to step into that owner side and find that balance, and to allow that to become part of also what they're working toward too.
Yeah, so true. And do you think that burnout is becoming the new norm of today's culture?
Yeah, I certainly think in certain circles for sure. Burnout seems to be one of those kind of things where it kind of catches a lot of different experiences for people. Certainly could be emotional, burnout could in the way that you don't feel like you really like doing what you do anymore, or feel like you're drawn to what you do anymore. I think it certainly captures a lot of physical burnout. You're just tired a lot of the time. You're maybe getting sick, those kind of things. I think it also captures some intellectual burnout as well, right? Like if you feel like you're just doing repetitive motions over and over again, kind of thing. So it does kind of capture a lot of different aspects of that. And at least in my experience, as far as burnout looks like as an owner, or at least in the perspective of being a therapist, I mean, there's also a lack of support. If I don't feel like I have a lot of people around me, whether it be my clinical team that I work with, or maybe it's my owner, or whatever the case is, I'm probably going to feel a little more isolated. The more isolated I am as a therapist, the more challenging it gets, I think, certainly because you're dealing with a lot of things that most folks are not dealing with in the like other fields. Certainly you kind of have the interaction with a client or whatever the case is in another business, and you may not have the same interaction with that client, twice. You may see that person once and kind of move on, depending on what kind of field you're in.
Mhm.
In the clinical world, you spend a lot of time with building these relationships, and that's really what healing is based on, is the building of the relationship. But as much as you put into a relationship, even as a professional or as a clinician, you're also taking there's some being taken away from that relationship, because that's what they're gaining from that, right? They're gaining knowledge, they're gaining time, they're gaining space from you, to a degree. So I think that as a clinician, you have to recognize, where do you fill that back up for yourself? Because if you don't do that, you're going to end up getting to a point where you're just going to be exhausted all the time. And we see this quite often from a perspective of people who, kind of stay solo and stay to themselves. And I think that's one of the things in our field we see a lot of, especially with the United States. There's so many people who work solo, with little support in that way. So we have a lot of people who are, solo practitioners, but they don't necessarily have a lot of support, so they're pretty isolated in that way. So burnout, I think, is definitely on the rise, for that reason, but also because people are not, sort of recognizing how to be able to combat it in an appropriate manner.
Mhm. And what do you think can prevent burnout? Like, what are the symptoms that people can identify that, oh, if I don't do something, I can burn out
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
set me back?
Well, kind of mentioned a few of them. I mean, certainly the idea that am I drawn to what I'm doing anymore? Do I feel like I've kind of plateaued? I think those are some pretty good signs. Again, it depends on kind of the circumstances. I think there's probably some places where that can look a little different contextually. Certainly, do you feel like you're dreading going to work? I've used some different stories on LinkedIn through AI and different things about, this dreading going into work on Monday. If you're an owner, do you dread looking at the finances? Do you dread doing some of those kind of things? That could definitely be a sign of it. I think the other one I've seen just in my own support groups that I've seen as far as with clinicians is that tends to be like imposter syndrome. I'm not good enough. I can't do this. I failed somewhere. I'm struggling with my own, belief that I can, that I have the confidence to be a therapist, be a clinician. So you see that, I think, being part of burnout as well. The fear that, you're going to have repercussions. A lot of times people will fear, legal repercussions or other types of repercussions as being a clinician. So understanding, kind of what your skill set is and understanding that, you're going to walk into situations that, you may not necessarily always be prepared for in a lot of cases, but can you adapt to that? And I think a lot of people sometimes feel like they're too rigid. And when they're too rigid, they tend to be, much more likely to feel like they can't do it. And so you have a lot of imposter syndrome around burnout as well.
Mhm. Yes, and what do you think that are the biggest mental and emotional patterns that quietly sabotage success, relationship, and well-being?
Definitely disconnect is a big one. Certainly, I think the more you disconnect with other people, the tendency to be more isolated. You're not going to be able to get your to be filled back up. We kind of just were talking about that. That can be professionally and in your personal life. If you're not taking care of your relationships at home and you're not spending time with people that are around you, the isolation can creep in pretty quickly. For some people, they actually find this, the isolating to be sort of a good thing, but I think it also gives you a space where, there's recharging isolation, and then there's sort of isolation just to kind of escape. And so those are kind of two different things. Recharging has to be things that are going to, fill us back up. Obviously, escapism is more about trying just to get away from it. So I think those are some pretty big things that happen that way. Mentally, I do believe that certainly when you talked about earlier, like kind of imposter syndrome, I think imposter syndrome has a way to kind of creep into people's confidence about, what they do, how they do it, and that kind of thing. Most people who are really highly successful, especially clinicians, are usually very direct in what they do. They know how they're going to do it. They know their system inside out. They're very, they have a very, A to B kind of process. It's not necessarily something that's going to be, they kind of guessing as they go kind of thing. I think burnout tends to make you question if you're really doing the work that you feel like you're doing or seeing that you're the work you're seeing. It tends to put you at the forefront rather than the sort of the client in that way. So that's something I think it's a pretty big sign of, hey, like this is something that's coming up for me because I'm spending a lot of time being in my own fear. That may not even be real, but it's my own fear that something's going to happen to me or happen to my life or happen to my relationship, my job, whatever. And so therefore puts me in that position of, I really don't feel confident to do this job. And that's a pretty good sign, I think, of burnout from the perspective of just you need to kind of take a step back and figure out kind of what's going on here and how do we can we navigate that. And so there's a lot of different areas of our lives that are part of that. And I think burnout can start to encompass a lot of those things if we are hyper focused on these fears that may not exist. And as an owner, certainly for sure, certainly as an owner, like the fear of not being able to do that job is something I think that comes with quite a bit. So like, kind of back to confidence, I think the lack of confidence has a lot to do with that.
Mhm. And how would you suggest our listeners to improve their confidence and remove those fears?
Well, the first thing is, like, so what I do is I kind of coach with people on understanding ownership, or at least that part of their career. So, or their job. So a lot of what I try to do is really think about, okay, like understanding your vision is the first part, really knowing, okay, what is your practice ending to really try to do? Who are the people you're trying to work with? Who are the people you're trying to get to? Who's your population, so to speak. A lot of that kind of came out of the idea of like what Simon Sinek says about what's your why. I think, what is your knowing what your why is and knowing where you're going and knowing why you do things have a lot to do with kind of helping you to understand your vision, understanding your kind of foundation you're working from. Understanding your operation, I think certainly like, what are my operations in place? What things do I have, my protocols? I've developed some different things to help people be able to kind of put those structures in place. So kind of taking looking at your operation as a business, okay, do we have, a good intake process? Do we have a, good follow-up process? Do we have a good, transitional place for our clinicians and our team to be able to help to meet the needs of the people that are coming into our practice? So that's kind of in our space of like taking a step back and kind of looking at what your operations look like, and is that fairly streamlined, or is that something I kind of, it kind of fell into place and it works, but maybe it's not as good as we'd like it to be. Maybe it could use some improvement. I think understanding your clinicians, getting a chance to, if you have other clinicians that work with you or work under you, getting a chance to hear what from them, what their concerns are, because I think that helps you understand, consistently put your pulse sort of on the business a little bit in that way, because you'll know consistently kind of what people are saying if you get enough time to talk with them. That also goes for administrative type folks as well, people who are support staff and things like that. I think the last part is understanding kind of just like, beyond just that part of it for yourself personally, reconnecting with things you enjoy, not only just mentally, emotionally, physically, but, things that that have led you into your field. So what is your moment that led you that made you realize, hey, I want to be a clinician. Hey, I want to do this work. What are the people in your life that made you feel like, hey, this is something that, I'm going to connect to in that way. And again, that may change over time, but, can you find where that sort of goal is? Now, for me, I've told this story before in our podcast I've been on, but like one of my first moments of understanding I want to be a clinician was, seeing people's identities be changed. There's a video out there of people like flipping their card of their identity. They have like one negative identity and then they kind of flip it and it becomes a positive identity. And that really was a video for me that kind of made me think, okay, like that's something I really want to be part of. I want to help people become, better versions of themselves. And so that was kind of something I've always kind of grounded myself in as far as like, this is where I know that I want to see, this when I started to get doubtful in my job or doubtful in my schooling or doubtful in that, I would kind of refer back to that. Okay, that was kind of my moment of like, hey, I'm stepping into this. This is why. So again, kind of back to what I said, just what's your why? Why are you doing this job? What makes this job important for you? What makes this job significant in your process of growing?
Mm. Yeah, you mentioned so well about identity. Yes, because identity um, re determines everything, right? Like it controls everything, what people do, how they speak, how they meet, how they dress, like that picture of inner self, like a picture which we have inside about ourselves. This is the picture through which we see the world. Yes,
Mhm.
and from your practice, how do you help people to change that identity? As you said, like they had maybe negative, then change to positive.
Mhm.
What is the best way to do such a shift, which you mentioned?
Well, I think it depends on what, as a clinician, I think that you see this in a lot of different ways of people identifying with things that have been shameful in their life, things that have harmed them, things that have been, negative experiences. And a lot of those negative experiences become kind of their mindset. And their mindset kind of is on a loop. It's like a tape player kind of playing the same message over and over again. How to replace that tape? Well, it's a practice of consistently trying to be able to, identify new things in your life, identify new identities, find that new one that you want to get to, and then replacing that tape by consistently practicing new mindsets and practicing new focus. To some degree, when I was working with addiction, a lot of times we talk about the idea of act as if you're going to do whatever the thing is you're doing. If you're sober, act as if you're sober that way. And it's a little bit different than faking it till you make it. So I don't really necessarily agree with that one, but the more so the act as if is like, continue to pour into the behaviors that help you to have this new identity. I think as an owner, certainly where you gain confidence and where you gain your identity as an owner really comes from understanding, like I said before, kind of your systems, but also kind of why do you want to be an owner and why do you want your practice to thrive? What about your practice sets it apart from everybody else? Because there's, a lot of people who do our work, but what makes you the best version of you is going to be that you're, as an owner, you're going to be a unique owner to other, clinicians. You're also going to be a unique owner to other clients. And so whoever you're working with, your identity, I think, has to really be found in, are you bringing that business, are you helping those people through your business to become more of who they want to be? And so there is a little bit of a mindset of like, this business isn't just about me and about money. It's also about giving back to the people that we're working toward. And how do we have the healthiest culture in that? Well, it really comes to, the mindset of, okay, are we going to focus on the bottom line? Are we going to focus on, which is important, but certainly is that going to be our main focus? Are we going to try to move more toward kind of an altruistic type of approach and say, okay, this is really where we're trying to, make the field and the sort of the culture of helping these people from a different, more like I said, altruistic kind of perspective. In that, I think that's a mindset shift that certainly as an owner, you can't always necessarily focus just about the bottom line of your practice. I mean, it's important, but it can't be everything.
Yeah, yeah, so true. And another question I have for you about mental health and about importance of mental health. Can someone build a successful business while neglecting their mental health, or does it always come at a cost?
I think your mental health does come at a cost for a lot of things. Certainly, people talk about grinding and those kind of things. I mean, that can be helpful to a degree, right? It's good to have some things that we just talked about it, right? To have, have goals and have dreams and have aspirations, but I think that can become your only focus. And I think there's a delicate balance, whether you're an owner or a clinician or just working in any other field, where how much of your identity goes back to being this person, whoever that is in the workplace. And if you're a person who wants to work 65 hours a week, I mean, you can do that, and that certainly will you might be able to accomplish that physically, but what's the cost going to be? It's probably going to be your mental health to start with, but then eventually it's going to be your relationships and the people that are around you because you're neglecting those types of things. And so I always think about like water in a bucket. Eventually you're going to run out of water if you're draining it in an unhealthy way. So eventually, if it's coming out from the bottom, you're eventually going to what's filling the bucket back up so you don't have to feel like that you don't have anything you're pouring from. And your business will take that. Certainly the mental health will take that. Your inability to sleep well, your ability to focus. Trying to do 10 or 15 different things at one time. I know as a business owner myself, like one of the things I noticed I've struggled with is just knowing that when I have free time, that my free time now I need to be more partaking of it in the fact of okay, I need to do things for myself rather than do things for my business because the temptation always is, hey, you could spend more 15 more minutes here on AI and do something or whatever the case is. And I think that's always a temptation I have is just that like, I could continue to step into that or do I need just to say, okay, enough is enough for today and step away from that. And that's a boundary that I have to put for myself. And I think everybody who's a business owner has to have some level of that boundaries because if they don't, those things will consume you. And that just seems to be what happens as humans. We tend to be the more we dive into it, the deeper we get. It's hard for us to kind of come back to the surface.
Yes, yes, so true. Yes, to find the balance. It's not always easy to find the balance because when people work for somebody, they have those regulated time, yes, hours when
Yeah.
they go for work and when they come home. But when you build your business yourself, you sometimes you don't have difference between weekdays and
Yep.
weekends. Yes, because it is like you are all yourself and you can have the temptation to do extra mile, yes, like more
hmm
hours in the evenings or weekends. And if it is not balanced, it will not lead to good results, yes, because nervous system can be overwhelmed and physical
hmm
health always cannot be sacrificed for any
Yep.
purpose.
Absolutely, yeah, and I do think that you kind of said that exactly right. Like the whole your whole body starts to respond to that kind of stuff eventually, or will be affected by that, regardless of whether or not you want it to or not. You have to be balanced. So whatever that look, and again, that looks different for everybody. I think balance can be different. It's not a set of rules. It's a better of how much are you pouring out versus how much are you getting in kind of thing, and that can look differently. There's certain things that fill people up differently than other things, and they might drain people differently than other things too.
Yes, yes. So if someone feels overwhelmed, burned out, or disconnected from their purpose, what is the first step they can take to begin turning things around?
So purpose is one of those things. I mean, we just kind of did talk a little bit about a little bit ago. Certainly rediscovering that sort of initial first meeting, first encounter, so to speak. I've utilized some things in the past about basically the 8 dimensions of wellness, which are essentially 8 different areas of our life that, if we have imbalance in, we tend to sort of, find those ways. We have a lot of distress around that if we end up having imbalance in those divisions of our life, so to speak. And just kind of to basic sense of it's financial, it's environmental, it's emotional, it's intellectual, those physical, those kind of things. And so I think our passion lies somewhere in the midst of us in those things. So I think a good way to look at it is, finding, okay, here's a list of things that I typically am doing, whether that's be all the things we just talked, physical, emotional, whatever it might be, and listing those things out and then looking at that and going, okay, where am I giving too much of myself? If I were to, give percentages of these things, if I'm giving 50% of my time to, my physical health, for example, and maybe I'm spending too much time at the gym, maybe I need to kind of cut that back to 40. Where can I give that 10% else somewhere else to, that kind of thing. That gets complicated with numbers and everything like that. So it may not be the best route for people, but certainly the idea of looking at it or trying to take a hard look at where do you feel like If you had imagined a pie of your life, if you had those 8 dimensions and you were in the center, where is one of those pieces of the pie being removed from? And where would you what's being replaced there? Because something else is replacing that, how much you take out of it. And that's kind of a way I look at it. I think that's really true about most anything in life, right? There's things that we have with that balance and it can get out of balance and that causes other kinds of distress for people. But as an owner, I think it gets hard to kind of know where those things, because those things can happen real quickly. Like it doesn't take real long for those pieces of the pie to get moved. And so you have to kind of realign them. And how do you realign them? Well, a lot of realigning is taking that time to calm down, slow down, take a step back and really focus on how to recharge. And if that's physically doing that, whether it's being outside, whether it's, getting some extra sleep, if it's, doing some physical activity you like to do, if it's being creative, those are all different things that kind of help you reset. So it's really about knowing when to reset and then also resetting regularly so that you don't get yourself in a position where um, you're taking too many pieces out of the pie and it gets out of balance.
Yes, yes, so true. Thank you so much, Patrick, for sharing your insights with us today. And this conversation reminds us that success means very little if we sacrifice our health, relationship, and peace of mind along the way. And for our listeners, if you found value in this episode, subscribe to Mindset to Result podcast for more conversations that help you think bigger, live better, and achieve more. And of course, follow Patrick Eilers to learn more about his work and insights. Until next time, take care of your mind and intentionally as you pursue your goals. Yes, so take care of your mental health and your physical health because you will achieve much more when you are healthy and balanced. Yes, as Patrick shared today, we have to balance and yeah, have processes, yes, systems, everything in place that will also add to our confidence. And before we wrap up this episode, Patrick, if there is one thing that you would maybe advise to people who are listening to us, who want to achieve more success, what it would be?
I always close a lot of these podcast interviews with this one line from a song by a group named Switchfoot, and one of the lines they have in one of their songs is called "Every breath is a second chance." And I always consider that to be true for business or for personal, right? Like you always have another opportunity in the next breath that you take. And really it's about if you're going to dive into it or not. And I think that's true for all of us and our potential. Like we don't have we're not limited to our potential outside of the opportunities to basically, continue to the next breath that gives us opportunity to do the next thing we need to do, whatever that is. And those small steps, they build pretty quickly. It doesn't take real long for us to kind of make those changes if we're consistent. And that's the big thing is not perfect, but kind of living in excellence, meaning that can we be more consistent than inconsistent. I think that's a pretty big step toward any decisions and goals you want to have in your life. And I would just encourage people to consider, living in that excellence every day, and that every breath that they have an opportunity to, that they can make a next move that they'd like to make.
Yeah, so true. And although we have big goals, but also it is important to enjoy every moment. Yes, enjoy every day on the way to that achieving those big goals. But every moment is such a gift. Yes, so when we live and enjoy life, having those goals and taking care of ourselves, we might be go slower, but we will go longer. Yes,
Hmm.
so
Yeah,
it's not always good to
absolutely.
just go so fast and then get exhausted. And like most of like if people are hyperachievers, yes, it is like a habit, like to always be in this like in this adrenaline state. Yes,
Yeah, be
like
in the zone.
yes,
Yeah.
and they achieve one goal and then immediately they set the next goal, right? So it is good to achieve goals, but of course it is good also to enjoy life, be happy, yeah, enjoy like family time and have your best life every day.
Yeah, yeah, got to. That's otherwise those goals will end up consuming you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Patrick. It was my pleasure to host you today, and I'm looking to meet you again in our future episodes.
Thanks so much, Elena. It was really great. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. See you soon.